Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, June 1st. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the to-do list for Congress is filled with regular and not so regular order tasks. Plus, the Coast Guard has plenty of tools to assess waterway risk. The challenge is making them work together. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The regulations for grants management are getting their second major rewrite in 2 years. The Office of Management and Budget has three main goals in its proposed rewrite of 2 CFR 200, including improving the transparency and accountability of grant awards. Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, joins me now to discuss what the proposed changes say and would mean for agencies. Jason, thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure, Terry.
What are OMB's three big goals for the new grant regulations?
Well, these new regulations are really implementing the changes President Donald Trump outlined in his August executive order, improving oversight of federal grant making. It also addresses things that maybe weren't necessarily in the EO as well. But let's be clear, OMB released this 400-page plus rewrite just last Friday of the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards. So, Terry, there's so much in here and there's a lot to go over, but let's try to pare it down a little bit. OMB says it's making changes that will, one, promote more transparency, accountability, and oversight for federal awards. Second, they're proposing to further clarify the regulatory status of OMB requirements and how future updates to the government-wide requirements will happen. And then finally, OMB also proposes changes that they say will reduce recipient burden. So there's a lot there. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything in this 400-page. Let me just offer a couple of highlights, things that folks have pointed out to me. So one change, as an example, would eliminate the use of what they call fixed amount awards and subawards. OMB says this can limit transparency, hinder effective oversight. They say, for example, under fixed amount awards, there is no expected routine monitoring of actual costs incurred by the recipient or subrecipient, so therefore no financial reporting is required. They just give you the money and tell you to go make good. Another big change would be the idea of termination of grants. Now, this will bring it more in line with the termination of contracts. Basically, hey, government doesn't like what you're doing. Hey, the government's not happy. Hey, the government no longer needs the service you're providing. In contracting world, you can terminate for convenience. And, in some ways, this change is also responding to a lot of the criticism that we've seen over the last year, specifically, for instance, ending grants for USAID. A third area of the proposed rule is saying that this thing called 2 CFR 200 applies across all government, and agencies should follow it. Now, this has always been the case in many ways, but like with contracting, agencies say, okay, we'll take the basics of 2 CFR 200 and then create our own version of it. Think of it as the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and then DoD has the DFARS. A lot of grant-making agencies had their own version of their 2 CFR 200. And what this is basically doing is saying, hey, we're putting a lot of burden on grantees. Imagine, you have one set of rules for NIH and another for FDA and a third one for NSF. This will cause cost and time considerations. Those are just huge for a lot of grantees. So OMB is trying to say, hey, we're going to try to create some standardization and some consistency across the government. A final change I'll highlight is really would put a political appointee really at the center of a lot of discretionary grant decisions. Now, OMB wrote that federal agency heads must designate one or more senior political appointees to conduct a pre-issuance review of all discretionary awards. Now, this is a big change because OMB basically wants to ensure that the grants that the agencies are handing out meets the policy objectives of the administration. And, of course, by putting a political appointee at the center of that, they're ensuring the administration's priorities and goals are being addressed. Terry, there's so much more in there, but this gives you a sense of some of the big major changes.
Jason, OMB just rewrote these regulations in 2024. So what has happened in just 2 years to warrant a 400-page rewrite?
That is absolutely right. In 2024, OMB updated the regulations for the first time in 4 years, but really, though, it was a significant update for the first time in a decade. That 2024 rewrite focused on grant-making applications, making them more understandable, using things like plain English, improving the grant applications access for underserved communities. I mean, it really was an overhaul, but in a much different type of way. The Trump administration says this rewrite really is doing what the Biden administration went too far with: diversity, equity, inclusion, all these quote unquote woke ideas that seeped into grant making. In fact, Terry, if you read through this, the first, I would say, 20 pages of this rewrite talks about all the problems that the Biden administration made during what they, again, this Trump administration calls the wokeness, the DEI focused areas of grant making. And a lot of these changes that the OMB is proposing, they believe will remove these DEI concepts and really prohibit agencies from applying these identity-based concepts to grants going forward. It's a very interesting and really, I have to give OMB credit, plain English approach to the changes. Again, whether you agree with them or not, that's not our place to say, but at least they make it understandable about what direction they want to go in.
And what kind of hot takes are you hearing from the private sector and former feds who've perused this 400-page document?
I think hot takes is a great way to put it. There's so much in here, and everyone I've talked to is like, well, I'm just digging in, or I'm just kind of giving you some initial thoughts. But I talked to two experts who follow this closely. Brett Fishman is the Director of Grants Management Solutions for F1 Consulting. She also previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grants Management at the Department of Education. Now, she pointed to a couple things. One big one was this regulatory structure change, making, again, 2 CFR 200 the main grants regulation across all of government. She says this will enable OMB to issue amendments to grant regulations that will automatically affect how agencies implement grant systems. She says future OMB issuance of grant regulations on behalf of federal grant making may reduce administrative burden on agencies as well as recipients, and of course minimize the implementation differences among agencies. One risk, she says, however, is this approach for OMB to update and issue these grant regulations on behalf of all agencies is that it may not afford the agencies who make the grants to assess the regulatory changes relative to their authorizing statutes. They may have to issue deviations to OMB regulations, and that may be required by law, again, adding more time and more complexity to this. I also talked to Dan Ramish. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. He's been on your show many times talking about contracting law. He says his area that he thought really stood out to him was the focus on the termination rules. Again, we mentioned that earlier, Terry, about how they're more in line with contract termination requirements. He says there's been a history of this uniform guidance in trying to revise termination provisions. They were first expanded under the first Trump administration. Then the Biden administration also imposed some constraints during their revisions. But he says this new effort, this proposed changes, really expand the termination rights. The expansion has given agencies more discretion to terminate if it's in the quote-unquote best interest of the federal government. He says this is intended to give agencies a freer hand to terminate grants. Now, the rewrite does acknowledge that the program legislation is a limiting factor of the government's right to terminate grants agreements. So at least they were saying, hey, if in law it says to do something, we still have to follow the law. Ramish says, however, if you look at all the pieces, the political reviews, the restrictions on some types of awards based on the administration's policy, and now these termination provisions, it's clear OMB wants to have more control over where grants go. And one big question out there is still, well, what does terminations based on the failure to effectuate programs of agency priorities really means? There's been a lot of litigation about what that is. So if a new administration comes into power, is that enough to justify a termination? That's one of the questions I think that's before courts today. One of the ways the Biden administration required termination rights was to add it into the front end of an award. So Terry, if you are applying for award, those provisions are there. We could unilaterally terminate this grant if we believe it's not in the best interest of the government. But if it's not in there, then there's an argument to be made that says you don't have that right to terminate. Again, a lot of this is trying to broaden agency discretion and for grounds which they can terminate grants. Terry, there's so much more to cover, but I think these are some of the big highlights.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for bringing us this story.
Always a pleasure, Terry.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the to-do list for Congress is filled with regular and not so regular order. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. As Congress returns after the Memorial Day holiday recess, the things they left on their desk are still there. And how lawmakers use the next 2 months could shape funding, oversight, and the runway agencies have heading into the fall. We'll get all the details from WTOP's Capitol Hill correspondent, Mitchell Miller. Mitchell, thanks so much for joining me today.
Sure thing.
Congress is back in session after the Memorial Day recess. It wasn't exactly a quiet recess. There were some headlines, but what's on the agenda now that they're back?
Well, clearly the biggest thing on the agenda is the reconciliation bill in the Senate, the effort to approve $70 billion plus for ICE and border protection. And it's essentially left off where they were when they went on break. But there have been some developments, including a really big development late last week in connection with this anti-weaponization fund of nearly $1.8 billion from the Trump administration that sort of really got everyone here kind of in a tizzy over where they were going to go with this because Republicans were so upset that this was dropped on them. And then late last week, you had a federal judge temporarily blocking that anti-weaponization fund from paying out any money or moving forward. We'll have to see exactly how that impacts the reconciliation process. But the bottom line is they still have to deal with this. And I think this is still going to come up. Several Republicans have said they want to put in some kind of legislative guardrails that would prevent those who committed crimes on January 6th and later were pardoned from getting any money from this fund. So that is going to be a big issue. And then, of course, you still have the White House ballroom and the security surrounding it. And we had the shooting outside of the White House, which again caused a lot of people to say, well, this ballroom is needed because we need more Secret Service protection and a lot of other things around the White House. So that debate is going to percolate again, even though right before they left, many lawmakers indicated that that was just a non-starter. But of course, we'll have to see what happens when they move on to a vote-a-rama because, you know, Democrats are ready and willing to put up a lot of amendments that they want to make Republicans uncomfortable with.
Mitchell, what is the path to passage through all of that briar patch?
That's an excellent way to describe it. Well, once they get through the thicket and they get to that vote-a-rama, I think in the coming weeks they are going to get there. And once they deal with all these different amendments and all of that, and then they sort out exactly what they are going to do with this anti-weaponization fund, then they will get to the vote-a-rama. They will probably have a long, long day, maybe into the night. And I do think that Republicans in the Senate will get it passed. And unlike in past events where the House decided they didn't want to deal with it, then the House would deal with it. And I think it will ultimately get approved. This will obviously go well past the June 1st deadline that the president wanted for it. But there are times now that it seems like the president isn't really that concerned about what is happening here on the Hill. And that also has a lot of Republicans worried as we move toward the midterm elections.
What signals does all of that send then for Reconciliation Bill 3.0 that the House has talked about?
I just think that Reconciliation 3.0 for many Republicans, and they've said this themselves, may be something of a political pipe dream. I mean, they do want to get something more done before those midterms. There's a lot of talk about a variety of affordability bills and ways that they can help people as we head into the election season. But look at the calendar. There's just not a lot of time. We're already in the verge of summer here, and you know they're going to be gone campaigning in August. I just don't think that there's going to be enough time to get something done on 3.0.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Well, Mitchell, let's talk about something they do seem to have some momentum around, and that's the markup of the 2027 NDAA. What are you hearing there?
Yeah, that is a positive sign. The NDAA sometimes is one of the few positive signs of bipartisanship on Capitol Hill. And they did have the House Armed Services chairman release details of this $1.5 trillion piece of legislation. $350 billion of that is supposed to come through reconciliation. Going back to reconciliation, the committee chair, Mike Rogers, says he's pretty confident that they can get that through reconciliation, but he says they'll deal with it if they get knocked back by the Senate parliamentarian on any various issues related to it. But it is going to be marked up in the coming week, and there is confidence that it's going to move forward. The next question will be, however, what's going to happen with the defense supplemental that keeps getting a lot of discussion, of course, with everything that's been going on with Iran. And the administration has indicated that it will at some point provide a supplemental, but there's been no real firm figure. It's been estimated anywhere from $100 to $200 billion. Also, there's concern among Democrats that the Pentagon is lowballing the amount that has already been spent on the war with Iran. Last week, Democrats sent a letter to the Congressional Budget Office saying, we want you to sort out some of these estimates. The Pentagon controller has said the latest estimate from a few weeks ago was $29 billion. Many lawmakers suspect it's much higher than that, maybe $50 billion. So certainly a lot of issues still swirling around in connection with Iran as well.
Along with that, Mitchell, one of the last issues that sort of ran the House out of town before Memorial Day was they didn't want to take a war powers vote that seemed like it was going to pass. What are you hearing there? Are they going to bring that back up?
They are, and it is actually scheduled to come to the floor this week on Wednesday when the House gets back. That is very likely to pass, and that's why they pulled it right before, as you mentioned, they went on break. It was all set up, all teed up to be voted upon. And then at the very last minute, the GOP leadership pulled it. They said they had some quote unquote absentee issues. Obviously, when you only have a margin of 3 or 4 people who can make the difference on a vote, that's a big issue. And so it looks like it is potentially going to pass, and then we'll have to see what happens in connection with the Senate. The Senate has also teed up its own war powers resolution. There's supposed to be extensive debate on that in the coming weeks. So despite everything that's been happening in connection with negotiations between the Trump administration and Iran, those are still hanging out there for Congress.
Well, Mitchell, maybe let's move to something a little less controversial. Let's talk about FISA.
That's right. Yeah, FISA is usually one of our most controversial issues, but in this environment, it's not as controversial. There has been progress there as well. As you know, Section 702 is the big part of that. The House and Senate in late April passed an extension, but there's still a lot of negotiations related to it. There have been some bright spots in the House. Conservatives have backed off from a demand for a permanent ban on the Federal Reserve issuing digital currency. So that's been a big issue. And so they're still going to try to push ahead. I think that ultimately that this probably will pass. They still obviously need to work out a lot of details on guardrails related to surveillance, which is a concern for many lawmakers.
What are the other top oversight hearings that are happening right now?
One of the biggest will continue to be the House Oversight Committee looking into the Epstein files. We got a little bit of news late last week from the chairman, James Comer, who said that Bill Gates, the founder, of course, of Microsoft, he is scheduled to testify on June 10th, and they continued to get more testimony last week. They spoke with former Attorney General Pam Bondi, so that's probably one of the biggest ones. And then in terms of just legislative action, we've got the House bill coming up, housing bill, I should say, coming up, which has been stuck in the House after passing earlier in the Senate. There seems to, again, be a little bit of progress there. One of the biggest issues there is the Senate bill prohibits private equity firms from buying single-family homes and requires those that are being rentals to be sold off for 7 years. A lot of Republicans in the House feel that's too constraining on businesses, so we'll have to see what happens there. And then the Clarity Act in connection with crypto is also moving forward. It got out of the Senate Banking Committee before lawmakers left town. So, again, some little signs of progress here in this area where, you know, Congress actually does do some legislating.
Little rays of sunshine. That's so exciting. But you did mention, you know, we only really have 2 months of work before the August recess, and then that's going to be focused on campaigning and the midterms. How's it looking to get progress on the 2027 appropriations bills before all of that other political concern breaks loose?
I think what's going to happen is we're going to see them chip away at a few of the easier pieces of legislation that they've been working on. They have made progress, for example, on things like approving money for the legislative branch, getting that out of House Appropriations Committee. But I think you're only going to get, as usual, maybe a handful of these 12 appropriations bills that are supposed to be approved, as you know, before October 1st, the start of the new fiscal year. And there will be a lot of talk about regular order and getting all of this done. But it's just not going to happen because we haven't seen this happen for decades. So I think that they will make some progress and maybe pass a few of these bills and make more progress on some of the larger bills. But as far as getting it all done before the fiscal deadline, it's just not going to happen, I don't think. And then we'll have to get back into that old topic that we always bring up, partial government shutdown or a full government shutdown as we get to the fall.
Mitchell, you left me in the clouds. Brought that sunshine for a minute.
After those rays of sunshine, too, right?
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thanks so much for joining me.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, fraud detection is getting more data-driven, and the Justice Department is raising expectations for how that work gets done. But first, the Coast Guard has plenty of tools to assess waterway risk. Their challenge is making them work together. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Looking at risk through one tool at a time can leave gaps in how the full system is understood. That's prompting a closer look at how assessments are connected and how they guide choices. For a look at how those pieces could work together differently in the Coast Guard, I'm joined by Susan Rezatar and Eric Cooper of RAND. Susan and Eric, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us. This is a great opportunity, so really appreciate it.
Eric, I want to start with you. You've got an interesting report out talking about how the Coast Guard manages waterway safety risk. Talk to us first about what their responsibility is in assessing waterway safety risk, and maybe what's changed in the operating environment that made this the time to really look at their processes.
Yeah, so the Coast Guard, their responsibilities for all navigable waterways in the United States. So that stretches all the way from the Great Lakes down through the inland waterways into the Gulf, across all the approaches and departures from the United States. So it's a really wide area of responsibility. And one of the biggest drivers for this particular study on risk was the collision of the Dali with the motor vessel Dali with the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore in 2024. As you probably know, there was a catastrophic collapse of that main span. That killed 6 people, and it closed that waterway into Baltimore for nearly 3 months, at a cost of about $15 million per day. And so following that bridge collision, the Coast Guard formed a board of investigation into the specific accident to figure out why the accident occurred, along with the NTSB. But they also subsequently formed what was called a board of inquiry that looked at what are the risks to critical port infrastructure due to the changes in the marine environment, which include the size of commercial vessels, increased traffic density over the last few decades. Much of the infrastructure in the waterways is really decades old, right? And it was built with these specific assumptions. But those assumptions have changed. The Key Bridge was built in the 70s, but since that time, the Panama Canal has expanded. It's got ships that are 3 times its size that transit to the East Coast now. And so given that confluence of events, the Coast Guard made that decision to really look at a holistic review of its multiple risk assessment tools and see if there was a way to do some improvement across that entire risk spectrum, which is obviously very important, right? Because 90% of our volume of trade is coming in through the maritime environment.
And Susan, Eric mentioned the tools that the Coast Guard is currently using. As you all started to evaluate those tools, what did you find? Are they working well? Are they being used appropriately?
Yes. So before I sort of dive into some of the details of what we found, it might be helpful to kind of review that there are predominantly six tools that the Coast Guard uses to assess risk. And each of these tools have been developed to look at a specific issue for a specific purpose. So it might be helpful to kind of quickly review. So there's sort of a large scale risk assessment that looks at approaches to the waterways and a little further out from the coast, perhaps. And that could there could be a lot of activities there, including infrastructure, wind farms, aquaculture, and that sort of thing. So it looks at approaches to these ports and waterways. They also have approaches for looking at new infrastructure sort of in the harbor or in the port, and some specialized tools looking at liquid natural gas. So there's a few tools that look at that level and at that particular situation. And then there are other tools that look more at navigation and safety and look at, are the buoys in the right places? Are there other navigational aids that need to be employed? So it's quite a diverse set of tools that were designed specifically for those particular purposes. There's also ad hoc kinds of safety risk assessments that go on with one-time event that needs a permit, kind of a thing. So what we did is to systematically look at each tool, and across the tools was develop a conceptualized risk management framework that's derived from well-established authoritative risk management frameworks developed by the International Risk Governance Council, Department of War, DHS, and Coast Guard itself. So we looked at the best of the best and developed this conceptual framework that we wanted to use to assess these tools individually and as a whole. And this framework includes 6 sort of risk management steps, if you will. The first being scoping and goal setting. So we've kind of alluded to the fact that, that many of these tools have different scopes and goals. Then the risk assessment, what are we worried about? Risk from what? What have we identified? How much? The characterization phase. Okay, once we've identified sources of risk, how much risk is there? The evaluation phase involves how much is acceptable. You can't buy down risk to zero. There will always be some level of risk. So working with stakeholders, what's acceptable in this particular waterway? And then manage. What do we do about this risk? And monitor. Have what we decided to do, has it been successful? So those are sort of the 6 steps. I won't go into any more detail on those. So for using this framework, what we did was we looked at the 6 tools. And for example, one of the elements we looked at was the goal setting and scoping. So we did a qualitative assessment of how extensive, if you will, each tool was in terms of the risk assessment piece. So how far along did they sort of take this calculation, if you will? What kinds of drivers, what risk drivers and hazards did they consider? And then in terms of the Coast Guard, what are the marine planning activities did they cover down on? So we mentioned aids to navigation is a focus, could be an element. Location of infrastructure could be another element. And we found there was quite a range. We sort of plotted these up, and so there's a lot of variance in terms of the scoping from the get-go. And so we found one in particular, the ports and waterways safety assessment was, generally speaking, the most comprehensive in terms of those 3 elements. And that is one that, they all involve a lot of stakeholders. We also looked at a lot of the risk assessments at the risk assessment steps. So this is, what are these risk drivers that each of these tools considered? And we developed, because the Coast Guard didn't have sort of a full suite of risk drivers, we were able to pull that together from various Coast Guard documents, but we pulled it together in one spot. So we call these sort of the captain of the port priorities. What are we concerned about protecting? And then looking at across the range of risk drivers, from environmental conditions to vessel traffic and so forth. And we found that, again, there were areas that had good coverage, perhaps not surprising. Historical information on surface vessel traffic and environmental conditions was pretty well covered by all the tools. But there were other areas such as subsurface vessels, human factors, and cybersecurity, or even future, thinking about what the future conditions that weren't always covered as well. So there were some gaps in those spaces, if you will. And then finally, on this particular question, I'd like to, one of the things that sort of struck me, I'm not quite the Coast Guard expert that Coop is, although I've been working with the Coast Guard for a while, is how different each port and waterway is, right? And so these tools have to be robust enough to be applied in a variety of settings, and that just accentuates the importance of having local knowledge, local engagement with stakeholders. And Coast Guard does very well in that regard. They routinely work with, stakeholders in the port, such as the Harbor Safety Committee, Area Maritime Security Committee, and the pilot associations. Those were named most often. So there's a strong connection there. But I think one of the important things here is that it's important to understand how these tools are applied at the local level, being able to have the expertise and knowledge to do that.
Susan Rezatar and Eric Cooper are policy and operations research analysts at RAND. Eric, let me come back to you. Susan's just kind of walked us through the framework and the tools. What did you hear from the Coast Guard as you went through this report? How receptive are they to the proposals? And if they adopted this risk management framework, what would change in how they make decisions?
Yeah, Coast Guard, working with Coast Guard is great. They're very receptive to understanding what the challenges are and how to make those changes. One of the things that we think the Coast Guard will have some challenges with is the fact that there needs to be, as Sue mentioned, a data integration that has standardized protocols across the different tools so that those tools can be categorized and that you can create prioritization for what's important. Some of the problems that they have is that when they do the assessment, there isn't necessarily a follow through. And part of that is because there's a lot of owners in the waterway. And so when the decisions are made, they may be passed to a different agency, and that agency may not have the funding, it may not have the same prioritization. So some of those changes fall through the gaps. But what might be a little challenging is just to build that integration of the data standards for the Coast Guard across their entire protocol to make sure that each of the tools are being measured in the same sort of process. But the Coast Guard is very receptive to making those changes, and I think that they'll look to do that. We haven't seen their Board of Inquiry report. It hasn't been released yet, but I think that's going to come out shortly.
And Sue, let me come back to you. This seems like a problem that is not unique to the Coast Guard. Lots of federal agencies are responsible for assessing and managing risk. If you were to take this risk management framework, how else might you think that folks could apply it?
I think it's, again, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we drew this from well-established authoritative risk management frameworks that are out there. I think it's pretty adaptable. It's very closely aligned to what, the rest of DHS does and what DOW does. There might be some issues when you talk about cybersecurity and information technology. There might be some more specificity that would be needed, but I think it's very adaptable.
I've been speaking with Susan Rezatar. She's a senior operations researcher at RAND, and Eric Cooper is a senior policy researcher at RAND. Thank you both for sharing the report with us and for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Terry. This was fantastic. Appreciate it.
We'll post this interview and a link to their report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, fraud detection is getting more data-driven, and the Justice Department is raising expectations for how that work gets done. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The DOJ's new FOCUS initiative puts a spotlight on the quality behind data-driven fraud claims, encouraging closer engagement with analysts who can show their methods hold up. That shift could change what kinds of cases make it forward and what organizations need to be ready for when they do. Here with more insight into how these cases are proceeding is Tom Suddeth, partner at Reed Smith. Mr. Suddeth, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Terry. It's a pleasure to be here.
The Department of Justice has just announced a new initiative called the Fraud Oversight Through Careful Use of Statistics, or FOCUS initiative. This is all about anti-fraud, but tell us specifically what's new about this and what is its purpose?
Sure. So the FOCUS initiative was announced by the Department of Justice earlier in May. And what's behind this is there's been a substantial increase in the number of False Claims Act cases that have been brought by private whistleblowers. And what's data mining is really the focus of the Focus initiative. And what it's intended to do is to try to provide some further guidance by the Department of Justice to private whistleblowers who are beginning to bring these cases to the Department of Justice, relying upon data mining, where they are accessing publicly available information, looking for what they believe to be indicia of fraud, bringing that to the Department of Justice and asking the Department of Justice to get involved with the case and so the data mining has been something that the Department of Justice has been using for a number of years in their False Claims Act cases. What's happening now is, I think, the Department of Justice is seeing a significant upsurge in the number of those cases that are being brought to them by private whistleblowers.
It seems like there might be two reasons behind that. One, more people have access to these kinds of tools. But two, DOJ has established some pretty aggressive whistleblower programs here so people can get a reward for referring these kinds of cases. Does the Focus initiative tell you that DOJ wants maybe some better data mining to happen here?
Absolutely. Yeah, Terry, that's I think a big part of what's behind this is, there's been a significant uptick in the number of QTAM False Claims Act cases that are being brought to the Department of Justice. Each of these cases requires the expenditure of time and resources by the Department of Justice to investigate. So I think what the DOJ is signaling here is that if they're interested in these cases, they'll pursue the right cases, but that they want on the front end, the whistleblowers, the data miners, to be utilizing some rigorous data analytics, keeping in mind that correlation does not necessarily equate to causation. And so the data mining can identify correlations, but in order to successfully pursue one of these cases, the whistleblower or the Department of Justice has to establish causation.
It sounds like DOJ is going to ask these folks to come in and show their work first to make sure that they've got a valid case. How will those conversations actually play out?
The way these cases normally are handled is the whistleblower will present their case to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice will then investigate and pursue what leads they can. What the Department of Justice is saying here is they're inviting people to come in and have a pre-complaint conversation with them to go through, explain to them how did they put their case together, what leads they follow, what are some investigative leads that they would like the Department of Justice to pursue. Because remember, the data mining cases are really relying upon publicly available information. That there's oftentimes not an insider, which typically you see in a lot of these cases where a company employee who's an insider can go to DOJ and say, I've worked for this company, here's what I've observed, here's why I believe this is fraudulent conduct. But what DOJ is suggesting here, Terry, is that they have a conversation in advance so that DOJ can, sort of vet the analytical process and to determine whether or not this is a case that they believe is worth pursuing by the Department of Justice. If the Department of Justice decides that it's not going to intervene, not going to pursue the case, the whistleblower is free to pursue the case on their own, but they don't have the backing and the resources of the Department of Justice to pursue those cases.
Tom Sedeth is a partner at Reed Smith. Tom, it sounds like crowdsourcing here. I mean, if I can put a common term on it, the DOJ is kind of crowdsourcing data analytics. Is this something that really should be done by the general public, or should DOJ have this as an inherently governmental function? And why does it matter which way they land on that?
So there has always been, under the False Claims Act, that there's always been this partnership, if you will, between the Department of Justice and the private whistleblowers. And the Department of Justice does rely on a number of cases to seek the assistance of whistleblowers to pursue these cases. what's new here, what we're seeing here is a significant increase in whistleblowers mining public data and coming to the Department of Justice and saying, we think we've found something here. As I mentioned earlier, the Department of Justice has used data analytics in its cases for a number of years. What's changing now is there's a lot of public information out there. AI is giving data miners the opportunity to go through a lot of different information, massive amount of information, put in certain prompts, and then do data analytics and present those to the Department of Justice. So they're using really only publicly available information for the most part in these cases, and then presenting those to DOJ saying, we think we've uncovered some fraudulent conduct here.
What does the evolution of data mining, as you've just described it, combined with this new focus initiative mean for companies, especially in sectors like healthcare, where there's tons of data out there? What does this mean for companies in those spaces, and how might this change the kind of cases that they're facing?
So I think what's happening here is this is not going to go away. There's going to be more data available. There's going to be more powerful AI tools available for data miners. What I think this means for companies, though, is that for their compliance departments, they need to be looking at the data themselves, and they need to try to identify if there are potential red flags, because the Department of Justice, together with its emphasis on pursuing these cases, has also emphasized the desire for companies to come in and self-disclose if they believe there is improper conduct going on. And if they do self-disclose, then they can put themselves in a position where they can get lesser penalties, perhaps a declination if it's a criminal case that's being pursued. So I think for companies, what this means is that there's going to be an increased focus by them to really be doing the same sort of data mining to identify what these, if there are problems, and then if there are, then they have to make the difficult analysis of what is the nature of the problem, what caused the problem, and is this something that we think we need to bring to the government before the data miner arrives.
Kind of taking on a red teaming approach.
That's right, exactly.
As DOJ is trying to raise the quality bar here, make sure that the cases they're going to pursue are substantial and valid, does this mean that fewer whistleblower cases are going to get through? Is there a balance between keeping the door open to people who have legitimate complaints or concerns and really trying to make sure that these key TAM cases are solid and tight from the data mining perspective?
I think what you're going to see is a greater focus by DOJ on these cases, and they're going to I think rigorously look at the analytics, look at the models that the data miners have used, and try to ferret out those cases where they believe that there is some indicia of wrongdoing, and those where it's simply a collection of data, but without sufficient rigorous analysis. How is this case provable under the False Claims Act case? Can we establish materiality? Can we establish scienter? Can we establish causation? Because as I said earlier, the correlation only gets you so far. At the end of the day, the government or the relator has to establish causation.
So as you watch this roll out, what are you expecting to see a year or two from now? How will the trends be different? How will the cases be different?
I think what we're going to see is we're going to see, I don't think this is going to go away. AI is going to remain a powerful tool. These cases take time and resources for the government to investigate. And what I think the government is saying here is it will continue to welcome these cases if these cases are properly investigated. And because I think these are potentially powerful tools for the Department of Justice, but in order to investigate these matters, it takes time, it takes resources, and as we know, the resources at Department of Justice are, these days are stretched a little thin.
I've been speaking with Tom Suddeth. He's a partner at Reed Smith. Mr. Suddeth, thanks so much for joining me today.
Terry, thank you. It was a pleasure.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Agriculture Department is relocating employees at many of its component agencies. That includes staff at the Food and Nutrition Service, which carries out SNAP and other food assistance programs used by tens of millions of Americans. But many FNS employees say they would sooner quit their jobs than relocate, according to an internal poll conducted by their union. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman has more. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry. Thanks for having me.
What is the plan for Food and Nutrition Services?
Well, first things first, they're going to go through a name change. That's about the least impactful change under all of this. They would be rebranded from the Food and Nutrition Service to the Food and Nutrition Administration. But more significantly, a lot of their employees are going to be moved to other parts of the country. According to plans that we saw last month, FNS is planning to shut down their headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, and a couple of their regional headquarters across the country in major cities like Chicago, Boston, Atlanta, and San Francisco. And they are going to move folks to other hubs. These are largely the hubs that USDA already identified last year as part of plans to move more than half of their headquarters employees outside of the Beltway. And this would really be people all over the place here. Employees who work for SNAP would be moving to Indianapolis. People who work in child nutrition programs would move to Dallas, Texas. Supplemental nutrition and safety program staff would move to Kansas City. And research programs employees would move to Raleigh, North Carolina. So a significant reimagining of where USDA employees live and work. It's worth pointing out that about 90% of the USDA workforce already lives outside of the National Capital Region. This would move that number up higher.
The union did a survey of the employees here. What did they come back with in terms of findings?
Yeah, so a local chapter of the National Treasury Employees Union represents these Food and Nutrition Service employees. And what they found is that based on the respondents who took the survey, the vast majority of them say they would not move if they are asked to do so. And about 80% of employees responded that way on the survey. Now, a couple of caveats here. Not every FNS employee took the survey, but the union says that about a third of the FNS workforce took the survey. And of that, an overwhelming number said that they would not move. So they say that that's a pretty good indication of how the rest of the FNS workforce feels about this. According to the union officials that I spoke to, some of them said that even some of the people who agreed to move say that they are still on the lookout for other jobs, that even if they agree to move, they may not stay with that job for the long term. They may try to figure out something else to do in the long term.
Jory, what impact would this have on FNS's ability to accomplish its mission if they lost, say, 25 to 30% of their workforce, maybe even higher?
Well, with the past being precedent here, there was a pretty significant reduction of employees the last time the Trump administration tried to carry this out. That being the first Trump administration. They tried to move a significant number of employees, hundreds of employees at the Economic Research Service and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture to Kansas City. This was all attempted back in 2019. And a lot of staff, about 85% of staff who were asked to move, either quit their jobs or retired rather than relocate. And that had a significant impact on the mission for those agencies. They had to hire up people because no one was really moving to Kansas City to carry out the job. And so the union suspects that this would be a similar type consequence under what may be to come here. That they say that if a significant number of employees choose to leave FNS, then that means that there are fewer employees on the job to calculate SNAP overpayments or underpayments. They would also have fewer people on the job to issue grants to nonprofits and other organizations and issue funding for disaster assistance when emergencies do arise. This is a portfolio of programs that are very public-facing. They cover about 82 million Americans who, in some way, shape, or form, rely on FNS programs.
These programs got a lot of attention during the government shutdown last year, in fact, for the number of people who who receive these kind of benefits. Does USDA have anything to say about whether or not they feel this is a risk worth taking?
So USDA didn't get back to me immediately for this story. However, in recent stories about this, they did tell me that they suspect that FNS and its 16 federal food aid programs will have no disruption as they look to carry out this reorganization. USDA Deputy Secretary Stephen Vaden told lawmakers last year that he's well aware of the high attrition that happened at USDA under the first Trump administration, but he says this time around, with there being so many federal employees out of work, that he suspects that many of them will choose to relocate rather than take their chances finding new work in the DC metro area. It's one thing to point out here that according to the union officials they spoke to, they pushed back on one key piece of USDA's explanation for all of this. USDA has said that this reorganization is really all about bringing USDA employees closer to the customers that they serve, farmers, ranchers, people who work in rural development. And they say that by and large, FNS is not that. They very rarely have a public-facing presence in their communities. These are largely office jobs. They usually do most of their work on the computer. In some rare cases, there are teams that go out to investigate cases where there may be alleged SNAP fraud or some other investigation, but that's the minority example, and that by and large these are people who work in office jobs and don't interact with the public in that way.
Jory, what about the folks who represent those beneficiaries, the folks who may be on SNAP programs or other food assistance programs? Have they expressed any concern about this?
I heard from Hunger Free America, a nonprofit that works in this space, and they also pointed out that this is all happening roughly around the time that FNS is carrying out significant changes to SNAP eligibility that occurred under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed last summer. USDA staff are at work implementing those changes, and they say a exodus of staff at FNS is just exactly the wrong thing that they don't want to be experiencing right now. They say that they need as many people on board to carry out those changes as possible. And so they are concerned about what this would mean for the Food and Nutrition Service.
I guess time will tell as it actually plays out.
We'll have to see.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for bringing us this story.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find the full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.